So actually, I thought I would maybe start off by showing you a couple of slides that I thought were quite interesting, which are when people start at Twitter, Ev and Biz do a presentation to all the new tweeps and to give them an idea about what the company is about, what matters at Twitter, et cetera. And I stole two slides from their talk because I thought they were quite interesting in this context. So maybe we could start off with that and then move on to where we're going. This is I think slide number 2 in the talk, which essentially talks about Twitter's beginnings. And one of the interesting things about this is how deeply that is tied to location. Right? So everyone knows the story about how Twitter kind of emerged in South by Southwest a few years ago. One of the kind of most commonly cited stories was a group of people were hanging out at a bar, and the bar was really crowded. And someone who had a lot of followers decided to move to another bar and just tweeted about it. And then all of a sudden, this huge crowd showed up to the next bar. One cool part about that is how deeply location-specific that was. Obviously, when Ev and Biz are talking about this, it's more about the history of the company, but I thought it was interesting how deeply rooted it was in this. Another one is, this is kind of to the point that Michael kind of a little bit laughed at, where Ev and Biz talk about the kind of general mission of the company, or one of the things that the company is all about, and how it is about the triumph of humanity, right? But one thing that I thought was really interesting is all the examples that they run through actually have a very deep geo aspect. And when we look at what we're doing at Twitter right now in terms of our roadmap for geo, a lot of these are actually representative of some of the key pieces of that. So I thought that would be kind of an interesting way to run through some of the things we think are actually really interesting. So the first image on the top left is from there was a UC Berkeley student that was in Egypt and was a photographer. And he was taking pictures of a protest, and he got arrested. And as he was being driven to jail, he put out one tweet that said, "Arrested." And by the time he got to the jail, the embassy had already been alerted, and all his friends knew about it, and they were already trying to do something about it. One interesting part about that is the routing aspect, where there's someone who has a piece of geospecific information, tweets one word from one side of the world, and it gets routed all the way to the embassy. He probably had no phone number, no name, nothing like that. The second one is a picture of the fires in Southern California, I think last year. And one of the interesting stories in that one was when everyone was evacuated, there was one person who stayed and essentially was tweeting about the state of the houses of various people on the state of the fires, et cetera. And the interesting part about that is kind of a scale question, where there's one person that is talking about something that is geographically interesting, and that one person is able to provide the type of coverage that the whole community was able to use. The third photo is a photo from the earthquakes in China in 2008. I think it was a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. And one thing that was cool about that one is that the information was coming out on Twitter even before the USGS knew about it. And so that aspect is about speed and how information from one point in the world where probably there are not a lot of Twitter users, information from that side of the world was able to go global so quickly. The one in the top right is as a result of some big storm, I think. There was a big gas shortage in Atlanta a couple of years ago. And people spontaneously started tweeting with this hashtag that was ATL gas and telling each other where there was gas. Obviously, the geo aspects of that are pretty obvious. But what's interesting there is kind of the emergent behavior where people kind of self-organized for something that was very specific and tweeting about exact locations. So the bottom left photo is in Mumbai, the terrorist attacks. So there's been a lot of coverage about that. One of the interesting things about that one was the kind of the distributed nature of it, where people from one community in general were kind of reporting for the entire world. And again, it's kind of similar to the UC Berkeley example, the China example, where pieces of information from one place in the world that were globally interesting spread so quickly. The bottom in the middle, so there's the protests in Iran from the elections last year. One interesting part about that one, so there's been a lot of coverage about that one, but was also the movement around people masking their own location on Twitter and setting themselves to be in Iran. And that kind of brought up an interesting privacy question there, where where people were given control over how they expressed their location and were able to self-organize from that perspective too. And that also drives, I think, a little bit of the approach in general that we have with privacy, which is we want to allow people to do very powerful things and do them with as little friction as possible. But we want to ensure that people have the full control of these. And the last one is from these protests in Moldova, where the story was that there was this woman who organized a few friends, brought them in for a 15-minute brainstorm, and within a few hours, they had 15,000 people that showed up for a protest. Obviously, there's a lot more in play than just Twitter here, but what was interesting is how this ability to communicate with some geographic specificity, obviously spreading through a social network, was able to actually generate direct action. So, kind of taking a little bit of a step up, I guess, when we look at the impact of IT in the last, say, 100 years, one of the interesting aspects about it is that actually it's made location less relevant, right? Like the printing press allowed people to kind of send books all over the world. The phones allowed you to talk to someone on the other side of the globe. Email allows you to talk with 10 of them, irrespective of where they are, and irrespective of what time they read it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of interesting to note that by reducing a lot of these frictions to communicating, and one of the historic frictions was location, because the only people you could talk to were the people in front of you. That's been one of the things that in the last X years has been slowly removed. One thing that's also been interesting is that by removing a bunch of friction from how people communicate, it has changed what kind of information gets generated. And one thing that we've seen with blogs, et cetera, is that people generate information for an audience. And essentially that's what Twitter is, right? It gives each one of us, it gives us an audience to express, the various random thoughts, sometimes, big thoughts, sometimes small ones, but it gives us an audience to listen to that, right? And it gives us a way to organize all that audience, essentially, right? And so it's kind of interesting, like how the existence of that audience, essentially the creation of a demand for that information, also has created the supply. 5 years ago, people were not ever digitizing or communicating, a thought about, a talk in a conference necessarily, or an accident on a bridge, et cetera, right? And so the interesting part about how that fits in with Geo is that one of the things we think about with Geo is that essentially it creates a market for things that are globally applicable, but locally relevant. Things that are common to everyone, but that are very locally specific, where maybe before they were not worth digitizing, they're not worth communicating. For example, just a couple of years ago, people never thought to broadcast to the world that they were having lunch somewhere. All right, and now it hasn't yet spread to the full world, but we see applications like Foursquare, Gowalla, et cetera, that are creating that supply and demand, where people are expressing where they are for things that before we thought were irrelevant. And some people call this the pothole theory. I don't know if people know this guy, Eric Hersman, who started this website called Ushwadi. And the way that the way he expressed this to me, I thought was kind of interesting. Which he was like, look, we all have maybe a pothole in our street, and I care about the pothole that's in my street, but there's a street next door, and I really don't care about that pothole. And when my pothole gets fixed, I want to find out about it. I don't want to know about yours, right? And in some ways, I mean, that is kind of one of the things that we're trying to do with Geo is essentially, allow people to talk about their potholes and find out information about the potholes in their streets and not have the noise from everyone else's. Right? Obviously, commerce is a big example. Like, we've known all the kind of the traditional example of, when Geo happens or when Geo happens in mobile, the Starbucks will push coupons to you. But one thing that's interesting now that, for things like, Groupon, for example, that have a very strong local aspect, there's kind of this self-organizing piece where, now there's a market for if you're a restaurant and you have excess capacity on a Tuesday night, you have a way to reach the audience that's locally interested in you. And that's something that, we've seen emerge also on Twitter where, for example, Groupon, that's one of the ways that, people actually find out about deals. Another kind of small example here, someone was telling me literally he was biking down Potrero, and he got a flat. And he was saying, one thing that killed me is that I knew that within less than half a mile, there had to be someone on Twitter that was willing to either sell or give me a bike tube. But I had no way to reach that person. But that's the type of thing that we want to solve. Like, we want to allow you to, if you're a cyclist, to be able to reach other cyclists close by. If you are interested in that, if you happen to be the person that might supply a tube, how do you express that? So that's kind of some of the ways we think about Geo. So in terms of the Geo team at Twitter, essentially, fundamentally what we think about is we want to create a frictionless way for users to both express their context, and by context, it's where you are and what you're doing, as well as consume information based on that context. So, quick kind of recap of where we were and where we're going. So last year we launched the ability to geotag tweets. One of the things that drives a lot of the way we approach these things is to keep them very simple, and we have an amazing developer community that's been driving a lot of new ideas and innovation, et cetera. And that was one of the first steps in that. Another one is local trends, and that was an example of starting to aggregate that information depending on where you are, depending on your context, helping you find what we think or hope will be interesting to you. Another part to it was infrastructure work. There's a lot of challenges in terms of like the aggregating the information, doing it at scale, et cetera, and that's where my team joined Twitter. And then we also launched like a very basic ability to geotag, by geotag meaning in terms of tagging things with real places. So you're able to tag your tweets with a neighborhood right now. Right. And so in terms of the next set of things, like some of the big priorities ahead of us, one is dealing with data. And that's not a real photo of our data sets, but I thought it'd be kind of representative. But as everyone here knows, Geo involves massive amounts of data, involves a lot of very disparate data sets that we want to figure out how to merge and combine. For example, when someone from that's say on application X, how do they when they generate a tweet, how are they able to refer to that entity in the Twitter world? Another important thing for us is, based on usage, there are a lot of very interesting secondary derivative pieces of information that can be created from there. And actually, my co-founder, Elad Gil, will talk a bit about this in his talk this afternoon. But for example, last weekend was a very sunny weekend in San Francisco, and there were probably hundreds of people in Dolores Park. Just based on the tweets from that one day, we could generate the polygon of what Dolores Park looks like. And that's just one example, but as people use these services, one of the important things for us is to continue making them better. Another big piece is the developer ecosystem. I mentioned it before, but this remains one of our biggest priorities in terms of creating the basic components for people to be able to innovate in terms of how people use our system. Essentially, Twitter is one UI or one take on this ability to follow what other people are saying about various things. But people have been different. Companies have been innovating in very cool ways on the model. And then finally, there's the question of beyond just actual physical location, what we call it events, but it's essentially the other part of context is the what you're doing. That is another kind of big piece of what we're working on in the sense of, it is kind of interesting that we're all in San Jose. It's relatively interesting that we're in the Marriott. It's maybe a little bit more interesting that we're in this ballroom. But maybe it's fascinating that we're in this talk, right? Or at least I would like to think so. But that's something that that drives a lot of the kind of thinking in terms of context, where it's not just the actual lawn or the actual name of a place, but what you're doing there. So that's essentially kind of where we're headed with Geo. I don't think we have any Q&A time, but feel free to send me an email or send me a tweet. All right.